Let me bring in the visiting Israeli journalist and analyst from the Times of Israel, Haviv Rettig, joining us live from Sydney. Thanks for joining us, Haviv. We'll leave Australia to one side at the moment. First, let me tell you, I want to let you tell us about the situation in Israel. Obviously, the war is going on. It's exerting an enormous toll on your military forces. You've still got 130 hostages you're desperate to get back. What's the resolve like in the Israeli community?
You know, it's hard to describe. It's absolutely implacable. Israelis know one thing, and that is if they give Hamas another opportunity, Hamas will carry out another massacre. Unfortunately, Hamas leaders, unfortunately for us, and certainly unfortunately for Palestinians, Hamas leaders have made that clear. They have vowed it again and again and again out loud. And so you have never, I've spoken with many, many soldiers coming out of Gaza, reservists who spent 3 months in the fight. And they're coming out and they're saying the war is going well in military terms. We have to think about the humanitarian issue. We have to find a way around it. Hamas's one strategy is to put civilians in harm's way in hopes that they'll survive that way. But those soldiers are absolutely committed, and all Israeli families of those soldiers and all of Israeli society, incidentally, Arabs and Jews alike, are committed to getting rid of Hamas.
Now, tell us about your perspective from Israel then when you're dealing with this. And the first demand coming from other countries, from the United Nations, from the UK, from Australia, from the US, is not first, Hamas release all hostages immediately and put down your weapons, then we can talk about some sort of an end to this. Instead, the first call now is for a ceasefire, for Israel to stop chasing Hamas and Hamas to regroup. This seems to me to be a completely contorted view of the situation. So how does that look from Israel?
I think Israelis are struggling to understand what the world wants. There was a message by a statement made this week by Australia, New Zealand, and Canada together. The statement begins by your foreign ministry, and the statement begins that Israel should not go into Rafah because there is a real humanitarian problem with going into Rafah with the military. And then the statement ends, and Hamas should be removed from Gaza or something like that. And what frustrates Israelis with statements like that is that there's never quite an explanation of how. There are 4 Hamas battalions right now in Rafah. They're hiding behind civilians. All Hamas is its only strategy for survival. It literally has no other strategy. I urge viewers to go and Google Hamas and look up and try and understand their warfighting. It is about hiding behind those civilians. What Israeli generals have to figure out how to do now, and we've seen this in Khan Yunis, which was much, much lower civilian death toll than the earlier battle in northern Gaza, in Gaza City. The Israelis are learning how to pull Hamas out of those tunnels, how to dismantle those Hamas battalions without that level of significant harm to civilians. That is probably, hopefully, what we're going to see in Rafah. But you can't ask us to leave Hamas intact so that they can do what they are planning to do and telling us they're planning to do, which is murder our children.
And it's worth pointing out when you talk about those different tactics in Khan Yunis and other places that in operating that way, in attempting to protect the Palestinian civilians, the Israeli Defence Forces put themselves at much greater risk. They surrender Israeli lives in doing that because they go in there rather than send in rocket fire. What does the end of the war look like and how far off is it, Haviv?
Right at the very beginning, back in late October, the defense minister of Israel said that this wasn't going to be a short war. There's the ground operation, but the problem with Hamas is they've spent 17 years in control of Gaza, building absolutely nothing except this massive network of tunnels, 1.5 times the size of the London Tube, in order to hide under the civilians when this war comes that they were planning to start. And so the problem that we have is we have to first take the above ground. That's almost completed. Then begins a long, grueling counterinsurgency to try and pull Hamas out from underground. And all of that has to happen tiptoeing around a civilian population. I agree with the world that there's a humanitarian crisis in Gaza. I don't think any Israeli denies it. The problem is that's Hamas's strategy, and we can't allow them to be immune. Incidentally, Hamas didn't invent this strategy. This was exactly ISIS's strategy. When the coalition led by the Americans and the Iraqis went into Mosul in 2016, 10,000 civilians were killed. Nobody blamed the Americans or the Iraqis. It was ISIS's fault. It was their strategy. We can't let them be immune because they adopted that strategy.
Just briefly, Haviv, we're nearly out of time, but of course Israelis in Israel preoccupied with an existential battle at the moment against terrorist armies. Once you eradicate Hamas, you still need to deal with whatever Hezbollah and others throw at you. But tell me about the perspective on the Jewish communities worldwide. You must be aware of the rising anti-Semitism here in Australia as well as in the US and UK. It seems unfathomable.
Look, it's uncomfortable for me to talk about this. I'm a visitor. I've been in Australia, I think, 6 days. But I can tell you that in 6 days, I've seen things that trouble me tremendously. If you go to a Jewish school in Melbourne or Sydney, they are protected with the kinds of gates that in Israel protect the Prime Minister's office. If you go to a synagogue in Melbourne, I was in a synagogue in Melbourne who were talking to me about how a week earlier there was a demonstration outside the synagogue and the synagogue goers had to be snuck out the back door. This is Jews. I have met Jews in Australia, in America, in Canada, in Britain, who are more scared than Israelis. Not because they face a larger crisis, Australia isn't anti-Semitic, but because they don't feel that the police take them seriously, they don't feel that the country itself takes seriously the threat to them. None of their opponents, none of the protesters against Israel who direct their rage at the Jews as if the Jews are responsible for Israeli policy, none of them need protection. None of them have to have their schools protected or sneak out of their houses of worship. This is one-sided, and the Jews feel it. And I challenge Australia to step up and protect them as Australians.